I've spoken a lot about Japanese Pokemon cards on this channel, but I wanted to see what it was like for myself. So I flew to Japan and I went to over 90 different Pokemon card stores across 5 cities. And what I learned was pretty incredible, all the way from modern through to vintage, old back, and vending series. I guess the first place I kind of start is ultra modern. So Pokemon cards from the Scarlet and Violet era. There is a huge influx of Scarlet and Violet era cards in Japanese Pokemon card stores. They were literally everywhere. It was the main thing whenever you walked into any store, and it makes a lot of sense because the boxes are on shelves again, people have easy access to them, and Pokemon cards are still pretty popular in Japan. Now, as a lot of us have speculated over the last couple of years and have heard from people that are living in Japan and gone to these stores, yeah, the cards in the stores are significantly cheaper than the prices shown online at stores like Card Rush and UUT, which makes a little bit more sense. I think we kind of ignored, or maybe we were a little bit naive, and the cynics were kind of on the money, suggesting that those stores were keeping the prices propped up online because there was a lot of international attention on them. So if you were trying to get Japanese Pokemon cards from Japan, you're probably doing it from stores like Card Rush and UUT. So it makes sense if that's the only way for an international customer to get them outside of eBay, that they'd be more expensive than they are in store. I was seeing them anywhere between 10 to 30% cheaper, which is like a significant cost difference and adds up if you're buying like a lot of cards at a time. Now, does that mean you should go to Japan purely to buy Japanese cards because you're getting them 10 to 30% cheaper? Well, I think there's cases for, and I think there's a lot of cases against, but if you're there and you know that you're going in the future, it makes sense to just hold off on those purchases online and just do them when you get to Japan. On top of that, there was a massive difference between the prices in the peak of 2023. You guys know that video, Japanese Pokemon cards fell off, where we spoke about how when there was so much attention last year, the prices were so high. Compared now, they are so much lower. So when you factor in that extra 10 to 30% reduction that you're seeing in the physical store beyond this crash that you've sort of seen online, they are significantly cheaper. Cards like the Miriam SAR, which was a huge chase card last year, the Iono from Clay Burst, even cards like Charizard, Ruler of the Black Flame. I guess Charizard cards are always kind of popular. To modern recent sets like Shiny Treasure EX, cards like the Mew EX, the Gardevoir EX, you were very often seeing these on shelves. Almost every single store would have a lot of cards from these really recent sets because they are super popular. That's what people are buying, and it's what people are trading back in and selling back to the stores to get more cards. I'd anticipate that the prices are even lower than when I went on this trip now compared to back then, which makes sense because there is such a massive amount of supply over there in Japan right now. So there's more cards, more people opening them up, a lot more trading and selling and buying back. It's still there. It's just that the supply and volume of all those cards is so much higher. The other massive bonus of being in Japan and buying cards from the stores is that you get to see firsthand the condition of the card that you're buying. Now, pre-2022, 2021, this didn't really used to be a problem when you were buying cards online. Almost always you would get a gem mint copy. The condition was assumed to be perfect. Nowadays, it's a bit of hit and miss. I guess you're kind of battling print quality, but a lot of those cards that are like gem mint or close to PSA 10 cards kind of get graded by the stores. I'm going to talk a little bit more about slabs in stores and the whole grading situation with card stores that are buying and selling a lot. But for the most part, when it came to like ultra modern sets, anything from 2023, 2024, the cards were in pretty decent condition. You were able to see the centering a lot better too. And after all the stores that I went to, it felt for the most part, most cards would have come back a gem mint 10. And so I guess like part of the game of buying over there in Japan is that you're trying to find, you know, those stores that are selling them 30% cheaper than online, and then take them home and grade them. And, you know, there's a bit of extra money you can make if you're doing a lot of trading and selling of modern Japanese cards. So moving on from Scarlet Violet brings us over to Sword and Shield, which is still kind of ultra modern. And again, these cards were pretty much in every single store. Granted, not as much as Scarlet Violet era cards, but there was still a lot of Sword and Shield no matter which store you went to. Obviously, the chase cards, the pricier cards were kind of still holding their value. While, like I said, everything has sort of gone a lot cheaper since the peak of 2023, they are still pretty expensive if they're a popular card. So like your Umbreon VMAXs, Umbreon Vs, any of your Evolution or EV Heroes sort of era cards, the Giratina V, the Lugia V, those cards are still really expensive. You will find them a little bit cheaper than what they are listed for online, but it's not going to be this incredible, you know, massive bargain that almost validates the price of the ticket and going to Japan if you were to go and buy like 4 of those, bring them back and then sell them on eBay or something. Other cards that kind of had their bubble bust a little bit, like Candace, those full arts that were really popular at the time when a lot of full art waifu cards were really expensive, those have seen big falls. But for the most part, Sword and Shield era cards were pretty much what you'd expect them to cost in store. Just that extra 10 to 20% off. That's a little bit cheaper than what you're seeing on Card Rush and UUT. Occasionally, you'd catch a store that would have them way cheaper. So Dragon Star, which was a really popular store between 2020 to 2022 that sold online, but then stopped selling to international customers, is just as good as it is in person as it was online, except now you get the benefit of being able to actually see the card right in front of you. So any Dragon Star felt like you went to was usually pretty good inside Tokyo and Osaka. Once you moved out of those main cities, there were a couple of Dragon stores that were, you know, a bit sus. And I got a couple of videos that I'm gonna jump in a little bit more what was going in those stores. Dragon stuff for the most part was pretty good when it came to like Sword and Shield and Ultra Modern cards. On the topic of volume, you weren't exactly gonna see like rows and rows of Rayquaza VMAXs and Umbreon VMAXs. There were some stores, but I would say like less than like 3% of them that would have like multiple copies of huge, massive chase cards from the Sword and Shield era. Maybe they weren't showing all the cards that they had in the cabinet. Maybe they had more of them, which, you know, is probably the case when you think about it, rather than just assuming, oh, there's only 2 left at this store. But you weren't seeing like massive amounts of Sword and Shield alt arts on the shelves compared to the Scarlet Violet era stuff. When it came to condition, if you were collecting in that period, you would know that Sword and Shield alt arts would usually have like a printing issue. So you'd see like a lot of vertical and horizontal print lines. You weren't really seeing cards that had massive amounts of edge wear or like whitening around the corners or anything like that. You would occasionally see like a card that was pretty wrecked, but it would have a significant cost reduction if that was the case. So while there was like a decent amount of volume of Sword and Shield and Scarlet Violet era cards, when it came to sealed product, it was a little bit different. We know that there's like a lot of Scarlet and Violet booster boxes out there right now, and that's because the Pokemon Company in Japan are reprinting pretty much everything. When I was there, Japanese 151 booster boxes hadn't reprinted yet, so those booster boxes were still kind of scarce. Now, I can imagine it's changed quite a bit. So I can imagine the stores that had sealed Scarlet Violet booster boxes we're gonna have 151 as well, but you would seeing that pretty much in every single store. Occasionally you'd see stores selling it for less than MSRP, which was pretty cool. I know that I picked up a few Shiny Treasure EX for about 4,000 yen. That store wouldn't let me pay via card, I had to pay via cash, but that was pretty cool. I mean, anytime you're getting a booster box for less than retail price is a pretty big win no matter what. But when it came to like Sword and Shield era stuff, totally different story. That stuff's not really getting reprinted in Japan. I know V-Star Universe did get a recent reprint, so I guess that's like the exception. Stuff like Matchless Fighters, Single Strike, Rapid Strike Master, even Fusion Arts, right? You weren't really seeing a lot of that on the shelves. And whenever you were seeing that in cabinets, it was at basically market price. So the sets that had chase cards like Giratina V and Lugia V, those were always going to be much, much more expensive than the Scarlet Violet stuff, which makes a lot of sense. Beyond the Sword and Shield era, it gets a little bit hazier. Occasionally you would see some Sun and Moon stuff, and I'm going to talk about Sun and Moon cards in a second. Sun and Moon stuff was kind of there, but again, it was really expensive and it was kind of just matching market price. But anything before Sun and Moon, man, after going to, like I said, over 90 different stores, felt like less than 5 would have a booster box pre-Sun and Moon. So stuff like Wild Blaze, Phantom Gate, Emerald Break, you know, those XY sets, you just weren't seeing them. I don't think I have any footage of those sets recorded from all the different stores that I went to. You just weren't seeing it. Sets like Legends, so anything from like Heart Gold, Soul Silver era, you'd occasionally see that, which is, I guess, more of like a marquee feature product that maybe a store would have in the shelves, have in the cabinet to like attract tourists, which makes a bit of sense. But apart from that, you weren't really seeing it. There was one store that had a couple of booster boxes and starter decks, which was pretty cool. Occasionally, you'd see like half starter decks. I thought that was always really cool because those cards, they're pretty tricky to get. They're pretty hard to find in good condition, but sealed product, pre-Sun and Moon, it just wasn't really happening. I feel like most sellers have either sold it or they're withholding it or they're selling it on the secondary market. So on the topic of Sun and Moon era cards, sets like Tag Bolt, Remix Bout, Dream League, this is where it gets a little bit harder. If you're a collector that's trying to find bargains or cheaper Sun and Moon alternate arts, special arts, you're gonna have a bit of a hard time. Naturally, the volume for these cards is drying up, so it's getting much, much harder to find those in physical stores in Japan. You do still see them. Like, I would be lying if I said I didn't see them. You'd see them on the shelves, and it was always cool to see, you know, like a Gengar Mimikyu just sitting there and being able to like inspect it and see the condition. But the amount of them just significantly reduced. It's nowhere near Scarlet Violet. It's not close to Sword and Shield. It's getting much, much harder, I think, to find those cards, and it's already hard enough to find them online. This is probably because collectors are less inclined to sell them to card stores because they're not going to get as much value for them if they were to sell it on the secondary market using Macari or something. The card stores ideally want to buy the card for as little as possible and then sell it for as much as possible. So it makes little sense for a collector to sell it for as little as possible when they can just sell it themselves. And sell high is what those stores are trying to do. The prices that I was seeing these were not pretty. They were very, very high, especially compared to the prices they were, you know, in 2020, 2021, when people didn't really care about them too much. So the stores definitely know how much they're worth. You're not going to really find them much cheaper than if you were buying them on the secondary market. It pretty much just is what it is. One thing that was really cool to see on the shelves though were rainbow rares. Now, people don't really care too much about rainbow rares from the Sun and Moon era. I know myself, the biggest gaps in my master sets from the Sun and Moon era are primarily rainbow rares. Rainbow rares are hard to find online at stores like Card Rush and UUT. They pretty much dried up. There was this point in 2022, 2023 where they just disappeared. But a lot of the time you go into a store and there were some stores that just had like massive amounts of rainbow rares. So I'm kind of kicking myself a little bit because I didn't buy too many of them. And that was probably my best or most convenient opportunity to fill in those gaps. The prices were about what you'd expect, you know, anywhere from 2,000 yen for kind of like irrelevant rainbow rares up to 10 to 15,000 for like the more popular, you know, anything that had like an Umbreon on it or a Gengar was going to be, or a Pikachu was going to be way more expensive. But seeing them all there was cool. And that's probably my biggest regret from the trip is not finishing off the master sets while I had the opportunity. Overall though, I think you're going to really struggle to find bargains for Sun and Moon alternate arts, special arts. It's just not happening. Like the stores know what they've got. People aren't really selling them to the stores and you're just battling this massive combination of condition, scarcity, and just popularity at the same time. So if you're trying to finish off sets, you feel like you're gonna get a sick bargain over there. You're probably not, unless you can cede a little bit of ground and start buying cards that you know are damaged, which are cards that have got a yellow sticker on them. So universally across Japanese card stores, if you see a card that's got a yellow sticker on it, automatically assume that the card is in some way damaged. However, that doesn't mean the card has like a massive crease on it, or there's like a clear scratch that just completely obliterates the worth of buying a yellow sticker card. Yellow sticker cards are the most fun that I think you can have in Japan, because if you see a really popular card with a yellow sticker on it and you inspect it, sometimes it's gonna be really difficult to see where the damage is on it. The damage could also be something that's kind of irrelevant to international grading systems like a print line. So you might actually find like what would be a gem mint card for a yellow sticker price, and you would start to see that massive difference in cost between the perfect card and the damaged card. And that could be anywhere between like 20 to 40%. A lot of the time the yellow sticker was because the card was off center, which does make a bit of sense. But if you're buying or chasing these cards for like a personal collection, you don't really care too much about resell or grading, then yellow stickers aren't a bad alternative. You shouldn't just like dismiss yellow sticker cards because they're automatically damaged. Now, different card stores have different systems, which is actually way more convenient. So if you're seeing a card that's got like a C state sticker on it, yeah, you can kind of like dismiss the chance of that card grading well. But if you're seeing like A rank stickers, right, and the price difference is 10 or 30% compared to the raw version that isn't a damaged or doesn't have a yellow sticker on it, well, you're probably looking at a card that could grade well, or it's a card that's going to look perfect in your binder but cost a fraction of the full price version. A lot of the time that damage is on the back too, or we're talking like micro scratches that you can't tell. So if this is for stuff like an artist binder, yellow stickers are a pretty good shout. It almost becomes like a bit of a game going into the store and balancing the time you spend inspecting cards versus the cards that you're buying. So if you've got a lot of time and you feel like you want to spend the whole day inspecting yellow sticker cards to try and find a bargain, that could be worth it. You could walk away with a lot of good deals. And if you're in Japan and you're looking for cards from like Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, XY, Black and White, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, a lot of the time you're going to be dealing with yellow sticker cards. You're also going to be dealing with slabbed cards too. So PSA slabs have a bit of interesting history in Japan, especially around about, you know, April to June 2023. There was that period there where card stores were actually buying PSA slabs from collectors for like exorbitant prices, way more than if you were to sell that slab internationally. If you're American and you were selling it to an American collector, you were not going to get nearly as much as if you sold it in Japan to these stores. This is partially because PSA slabs became really popular and because it was difficult to grade cards from Japan with PSA. So the quick shortcut to that was just buy them from people that already had them and then put them in the shelves, and then the stores were able to sell them for the really, really high prices that customers in Japan were actually paying for them. And we're talking about Japanese cards here too. Now that it's become a lot easier to grade cards in Japan for collectors or for stores, a lot of that popularity has kind of disappeared, but what they're left with now is a lot of slabs. So there were some stores that just had a massive amount of slabs. The prices were actually half decent on them. A lot of the time you would find a PSA 10 of a card, and a lot of the time this was Rayquaza VMAX from Blue Sky Stream, and the PSA 10 would be the same price as the raw card. So it didn't make any sense to buy the raw version when the PSA 10 version was right there for about the same. You can also find ridiculous deals for PSA 9 cards. So kind of looked like they were kind of liquidating slabs, which was a weird sight. Then you'd see stores that were selling slabs but would have a lot of damaged cards for sale. And when you connected the dots, it was probably because that store was selling all the cards that they deemed gem mint. and then putting the ones that they were like, oh, these aren't going to be PSA 10s or 9s, they were putting those on the shelves and then selling them to people. So there's nothing really wrong with that, provided the prices aren't too high. But if you didn't like it, you didn't have to buy it. That was one thing to be wary of. If you saw a store that was selling a lot of PSA 9s and 10s, you probably want to just be like a little careful with the raw cards that you were buying in that store. So if you were buying them with the intent to grade, you'd probably be a little bit hesitant. I would be anyway. And this is something that I only learned on that trip. It's kind of hard to learn unless you go to the stores and you're seeing this and you're seeing so many different stores and their approach to selling slabbed, raw, and damaged cards. So it was a really interesting, it was actually quite eye-opening, and it's changed the way that I collect Japanese Pokemon cards now. And there were a few instances where I was in a store looking at the raw card where the store had the PSA 9 of the exact same card on the shelf, and the price difference was like, 2,000 or 3,000 yen, which when you think about it is roughly the cost of grading plus a little bit. So it made more sense. And that was especially the case for Black and White, XY, Diamond Pearl, Platinum era cards. So if you thought tracking down Sun and Moon era cards was going to be hard because you're battling condition, price, and volume, Black and White, XY, significantly harder because the volume just simply wasn't there. And when you did find raw cards from that era on the shelves, almost always they were damaged. Heart Gold and Soul Silver era cards, Legends cards, those were a little bit easier. Occasionally you'd go into a store that would just have like a massive amount of Heart Gold, Soul Silver stuff, which was really weird. But then you'd go to like 10, 20 stores after that and you wouldn't see any on the shelves. Finding the absolute best cards, the chase cards from those booster boxes in cabinets, was extremely difficult and very rare, which makes sense. When you actually think about it, it's been about 10 to 15 years since those sets came out, which is a very long time. But it would also be so confusing at the same time because while we know that the chase cards were really, really expensive at these stores and the booster boxes are super expensive online and in these stores whenever you were actually able to find them, the rest of the cards from those sets were kind of cheap depending on what you consider cheap. So let's say you're working on like an artist binder or you've got a collection goal for one Pokemon and you're trying to get that Pokemon across all different eras. A lot of the time, if you were able to find the rare holographics from these sets or even the commons and uncommons, the prices on them were pretty cheap for Heart Gold and Soul Silver. But where it really shone was with Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. That is where a lot of the times you would find cards that you would expect to be really expensive considering how old they were. So if you're a US collector, you were kind of feasting because of the whole situation with the USD versus Japanese yen right now. But even as an Australian collector, it was delicious is the word that I would use for it. I was having a great time picking up these really, really old cards in really good condition too. The people kind of just like overlooking because they're so focused on the chase cards from those sets. Commons and uncommons were a little bit different. I know I did say that there were some stores that had them in the cabinets and you could see them there. A lot of the times you just wouldn't see them at all unless you went diving into those loose boxes. So depending on the store that you go into, you can occasionally sift through boxes that just have raw cards in them. They do tend to have a bit of damage on them because they are so old. It's kind of like foregone. The card is not going to be in perfect condition. It did really feel like those have already been looted. I would occasionally look through them. In total, I probably bought like 10 to 15 cards from loot boxes. Why do I call them loot boxes? I guess that's kind of like what they are. I also didn't really like going through these because it's just so time consuming unless you're like adamant that you have to find this one card by this one artist from this one set. Over the 90 that I went to, I don't think I went into one store that had Black and White or XY era cards. Where it actually surprisingly gets easier though is E-series cards. I'm talking stores like okJLUV. I made a video about this store on my channel in Akihabara, and even this year when I went, they still had them for the same price in the same pretty decent condition too. So I guess that brings me to my absolute favorite era of Pokemon cards to collect right now, which is the vintage E-series VS era of Pokemon cards. And every time I would see cards from this era in stores, I would just be left scratching my head because they were so cheap. Now, again, it comes down to your definition of cheap, but when I'm seeing cards that are bordering 25 years old, still sitting in cabinets for like 2,000 to 3,000 yen, I'm having a great old time. I feel like they're kind of undervalued. Maybe they're underappreciated, but the art from this era is incredible. So every time I would go into a store and find E-series cards, I'd get stuck. Now, condition is your biggest enemy here. I'm not saying that these cards are like gem mint or even mint at those prices. Obviously, the better the condition of the card and the rarer the card, the bigger the chase, yeah, they're not cheap anymore. They're pushing that, $300 to $500 to even like $1,000 mark. So it gets a little bit more expensive. And that was the case irrespective of era. If you're looking at like GBA era stuff, you're looking at EX Holland Phantom stuff, especially you would find like, the Charizard would be extremely expensive. But the lesser known or like the lesser appreciated or valued cards, every now and then you just find them at these bonkers prices. You kind of also get stuck having to make a decision with the slabbed version of the card. So you're seeing the card on the shelves. Now, you know the one on the shelf is probably a little bit damaged. If you look at it and inspect it, almost always you would see a bit of damage, which is a bit disappointing. But you have to ask yourself, is it worth buying the raw, putting it in the binder, or am I better off just buying the slabbed, cracking the slab, putting that 9, you know, which could maybe even regrade a 10 in the binder. So you have to pick and choose what you're kind of after there, and it is a little bit difficult. But honestly, despite the fact that these cards are damaged at the prices that you were seeing them at, I still really think it's worth it. I could be personally biased because this is basically all I'm collecting right now, but the art from this era is incredible. The holo absolutely slaps. The aesthetic on them is timeless. They're appreciated in English, so it's kind of weird how we don't kind of appreciate them as much in Japanese. And seeing them all there, like I said, I'd get stuck in stores. I'd want to spend more than I could. So you do have to, like, you know, be careful. Don't spend outside of your means. Honestly, it was some of the most fun that I had in Japan. I bought a lot of cards from that era. And then even going further back, looking at like the real true vintage stuff, you were still finding success there. I honestly thought that base set, jungle, fossil, neo, all those cards were gonna be gone. It did depend on the store, so don't automatically assume that every store that you go into is gonna have a bunch of vintage stuff. I'd say out of all the stores that I went to, roughly, you know, 5 to 10% of the stores would have them. And you'd kind of know instantly whether the store was gonna have it or not. If you saw a store that had like a lot of ultra modern, Scarlet Violet stuff and only had like 2 or 3 cabinets for cards, chances are they weren't gonna have vintage. Occasionally the store would have like this really random area for vintage cards and then have like the most obscure selection that'd be like 10 to 20. But if you walked into a store and you would see like a massive aisle of them, you were in luck. Naturally, you have to assume that all the cards that you're inspecting from this era are damaged in some way, but the prices are reflective of that. So it's not like you're spending 3,000 yen on a damaged common or uncommon. You were spending, you know, 100 to 800 yen, depending on the Pokemon or the artist. And that was actually quite interesting. You know, you see a lot of Kamiya cards that would be more expensive than any other card from that set. I think international collectors are coming to try and fill out their artist binders because it's so much easier to do it in Japan. But seeing them all laid out in some of those stores, just absolute massive amount of selection behind these cabinets and just going through and finding cards that you were specifically looking for as well. It was very, very fun. You're having an absolute ball if you're a Pokemon fan. Like I was saying with the E-Series card, when it came to the chasers, the rare holographics, it was a bit harder to decide whether it was worth buying them or not. So stuff like Dark Espeon or Light Arcanine, those were 2 kind of cards that I had my eyes on there. There were some cards that I kind of just left because I was like, it's not worth spending all this money on this raw card when I know that the PSA 9 back home is cheaper. But if you were okay buying like absolutely berserker cards that were like super damaged, and then getting them for that really good price just to put them in your binder, that's where the true value was. And I think that's where the true fun was. Vintage in Japan, in my opinion, is still really, really fun. Obviously, it's nowhere near what it would have been, you know, pre-2020, but it is still there. You're not completely priced out, especially if you go way further back to vending series stuff. And that's what surprised me probably the most about this trip. So if you didn't know, vending series cards came on a sheet that you would buy from a vending machine, and then you'd have to peel the card off of it. And this was before cards were in packs. So these cards are really, really, really old. Out of all the stores that I went to, there was only one store that actually had a sheet intact for sale, and it was pretty expensive. Didn't buy it. So it was cool to see it in hand, but seeing an intact sheet, yeah, that was extremely rare. As for the cards themselves, stores that had like a good selection of vintage cards, like okJLUV in Osaka, would very often have vending series cards for sale in them. And the condition for a lot of those cards was actually pretty good. You kind of go in expecting creases or like massive scratches or dents on them. Nah, it wasn't anything like that. You know, you'd look at the back and there'd be like edge whitening. Some cards would be worse than others, but for the most part, the cards were in really, really good condition. Out of all the stores that I went to, I'd say maybe like 5 to 10, if that. I'd say 5 is probably more realistic, would have a good selection of vending series cards. The vintage cards that were really hard to find though, no rarity. And I think that's kind of a given because those are really, really old. And I think they've all been vacuumed up. Out of all the stores that I went to, one store had a decent collection. Not a fantastic, but they had like a good amount to look through. And that was in Ikebukuro. And that was cool to see. It was very cool to see those cards on display there. Naturally, they were extremely expensive because they are so sought after. But aside from that, occasionally a store that would have a good vintage selection of cards would have like 1 or 2 no rarity cards. I know Torakak Camp in Nagoya had 1 Chansey on the shelf that I didn't even notice while I was there. So yeah, you know, even then it's hard to spot these cards unless you're specifically looking for them. But when you do find them, the condition, 50-50, and the price extremely expensive. But even if you're not in the market for those cards, it's just cool to see them there. Like, you want to be able to see those cards. It feels almost like a museum in some of these stores. The amount of cards they have across so many different eras. You know, Toro Card Comp in Nagoya, I made a full video talking about how cool it was to just go in there and see everything from the start to now. And I think that's the one certainty if you do go to Japan and you are Pokemon card shopping over there, is that you're gonna have a very good time. If you're going to fill out an artist binder, you're gonna have an absolute blast. It's so much easier than trying to find, you know, these obscure singles from these sets that people have forgotten about online. You go to a store, you find it on the shelf, it just feels so much better. As long as you level your expectations, you don't go over there assuming you're gonna find mint and gem mint vintage era cards for really, really crazy prices, you will have a good time. You won't leave disappointed. You gotta work for it though. You have to go to so many different card stores. Luckily, I'm working on a massive series that is gonna show you all of my favorite card stores across so many different cities in Japan. So while you wait for that, make sure to hit subscribe, like, check out a few other videos on the channel. But until those videos come out, thanks as always for watching, and I hope you learned a little bit today.